Good morning, it's Richard Edelman from New York, and I'm here today to unveil the results of the 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer. Following my presentation, we'll have Gillian Tett of the Financial Times and a panel of global experts, CEOs, and government officials to discuss the findings. So I'm going to go straight to it. We started the Trust Barometer after the battle in Seattle in 1999. We wanted to understand the impact of NGOs on global society and found, in fact, that NGOs were the most trusted institution in global society. So that is not today the finding. In fact, in our study, which we've done in 28 countries during the early part of November, with 36,000 respondents, we find, in fact, a big change. So moving on to 22 years of trust. Among the most important findings over that period of time, NGOs were the most trusted institution for 19 years. We found post the financial crisis that business trust collapsed. It was followed, in fact, by a decline in government trust due to the impasse in Brussels on Greek debt, the blockade in DC over the spending limits, and what we now find is a cycle of distrust, especially between the media and government. So here we go. We believe that we are in a new low level of distrust in the world, that in fact, business is the sole trusted institution. NGOs close, but contrast that to May 2020, only 18 months ago, where government was the most trusted institution in the world. It was the only one big enough to manage a crisis of the size of the pandemic. And government, in short, has failed that test. In short, media and government today are seen as divisive. They are locked in a cycle of distrust. By contrast, both business and NGOs are seen as unifying forces in society. News sources have failed to fix their problem of trust. We see this as an airplane slowly losing altitude. It's not a crisis, it's not plunging yet, but social media is at a crisis point in Western Europe. Traditional media is at a crisis point in parts of Asia, in particular in Japan and Korea, and also in the United States. Fake news is the core problem. This is a universal dilemma for news organizations, and the extent to which social media has polluted the bloodstream is evident by this concern about fake news. People want government to lead on societal problems, but the crisis is in government because it doesn't get results. Note that only 42% of people believe that government can execute plans. 44% believe that government can execute on a leadership basis across institutions. You'll see also that the result of this is that institutions are perceived as having failed in the two biggest challenges of our time, which is the pandemic and climate change, across the board. So we have big problems and an inability of institutions to solve them. At the same time, societal fears are on the rise. How can you run fast forward if in fact you're looking behind yourself? 85% of people are worried about job loss because of the pandemic or because of automation, followed by climate change, cyber hacks, losing freedoms, and racism. We also, though, see a cycle of distrust. Let me try to explain this model. In fact, we have a government that is sowing division because it leads to votes. Media, unfortunately, follows with information that suits polarities, and it's causing societal instability between division and disinformation. What we have to do is find a way to break this cycle with quality information. The failure of leadership is evident. It is making the problems worse. Distrust is now the default sentiment in the world. Take a look. Only 42% trust government leaders, 46% journalists, 49% CEOs. Who do they trust? Scientists, co-workers, and interestingly, my CEO, a theme that we've discussed in the past, which is trust is local, in my company, in my coworkers. Therefore, big obligations onto CEOs to speak up. This slide is stunning. 2/3 believe they're being lied to by our traditional leaders, whether journalists, government, or business leaders, purposely trying to mislead us in order to get popularity or to get clicks. The mass class divide became evident first in 2012. It was about a 4-year lag time from the Great Recession. But what's happened is it's become transversal. It's become across the world. Note that between the top 25% of income and the bottom 25% of income, you see big divides in countries as diverse as Thailand, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Germany, Holland. So in short, Western democracies, monarchies, Asian success stories, in short, mass class divide transversal. The politics of the world are getting more distrusting. What you see is a collapse of trust among Republicans in institutions in the United States, especially in business. For the first time, Republicans trust business less than Democrats. That is a shocking finding. In short, Republicans believe that business has gone too far, that CEOs are woke, that in short, the job is shareholders. It's not a broader societal context. But also in media, 24% trust in media among Republicans. That is effectively a signing off of media. Trust has become local. Less trust for outsiders, closer bonds with neighbors and coworkers. Again, to the thesis, my CEO, my company, my community. More nationalism, more provincialism. Distrust is now the default in society. I distrust unless I see evidence. I also believe that our society lacks the ability to have a constructive dialogue. We can't have civil discourse. This is corrosive for democracy. And that's why we've seen a collapse of trust in democracies. Here what we see is there is no democracy in the blue color. In the general population, for the first time in 20 years that we've been doing this study, not a single democracy is seen as in trustworthy land. In short, the big losers this year, Germany, Australia, Holland, South Korea, the US. The US is the saddest story of all over the decade, dropping from a solid middle to a bottom 4. 4 of the 5 in the bottom are democracies. Why? It's because developed countries lack economic optimism. Not a single democracy in the developed world believes that its families will be better off in 5 years. That's a deep condemnation of the system. I'm going backwards. I'm afraid. And therefore, I question capitalism. More people question the validity of capitalism today than ever before. More than half of our respondents say it does more harm than good, and a full 1/3 believe centrally managed economies do a better job than free market economies. This is a very important slide. The people of China have a deep trust in their institutions. In contrast, America and Americans have a low trust in their institutions. This is the widest gap we've ever seen in trust between the two countries. The biggest gap is actually in government. The Chinese believe in their government, the Americans don't. And there's very little difference between the institutions in China, but I want you to see that there are relatively large gaps between institutions in the US, 10 points or more. Now, also important to say, brand China is at an all-time low. If you're a company that's a Chinese company wearing that flag into the game, you only have 31% trust. If you're wearing the American flag on your jersey, you have 53% trust. Again, a solid middle. We believe that societal leadership is now a core business function. I'm going to try to prove this case. All stakeholders, from consumers to employees to investors, now hold business accountable for societal issues. I'm a belief-driven buyer, 60%. I'll only buy brands that advocate for my beliefs. I'm a belief-driven employee, 60%. I will only work at Allianz if I believe in what Oliver is doing. I'm also, as an institutional investor, 88% say I put ESG at the same level as financial performance or operational excellence in buying shares. This is a major change in money markets. Again, I want to reiterate the centrality of the thesis, my employer. My employer is 16 points higher than business in general. My employer is universally trusted around the world. Trust is local, therefore responsibility to speak up. A shocker. My employer media, for the second year in a row, is the most trusted source of information. Again, whether it's about the pandemic, whether it's about reskilling, this channel is not seen as politicized. It is seen as honest and therefore something I can believe, in contrast to government, media, or other. CEOs. This is a vital slide also because CEOs are to be seen as the face of change. I, as an employee, want my CEO to speak up. 60% of employees say this about controversial social and political issues that I care about. CEOs to be personally visible when discussing public policy. Now, important distinction. Inform policy, don't influence politics. This is a very fine line about labor practices in China or several other issues. But on jobs in the economy, about technology and automation, about wage inequality, etc. What not to do? Try to help pick who the next leader of the country is. Stay out of politics. How are we going to break this cycle of distrust? Well, here's a way. This is our model. Competence on the x-axis, ethical behavior on the y. We've been following this for years. What's happened is that you've seen government creep down to the bottom left. Business to the top right. NGOs have recovered into also being in the top right. So, business is 53 points more competent than government. A shocking finding. NGOs, the most ethical. Business improved on ethics. Again, if you think about the model sort of like a seesaw at the playground, NGOs and business have to be stabilizing forces for weak performance by media and by government. Over time, to get to stability, we have to get government and media to move closer to the top right. We actually thought this year that we had reached a limit for how much business should be involved on societal issues. We were wrong. Business engagement on societal issues people want more of, not less. 5 times more for climate change, economic inequality, workforce reskilling, and then somewhat less on injustice, only 4 times as much. In short, we want more, not less, of business as the stabilizing force. Why? Because business is effective, but business is also visionary. I want you to note, however, NGOs score very highly here. Business would be smart to do more partnering with civil society, not less. The last few years, it's been a little bit push away. Don't do that. Put the arms around and work with civil society. Cautionary note, fairness. Business scores poorly on fairness. That mass-class divide is partly chalked up to business. A central thesis of the Trust Barometer 2022, good information can help close the societal divide. How do we know this? Because a person who's in that low-income group, who is well-informed, has a 10-point bump in trust in institutions. By contrast, a person who's in the high-income group, who's not well-informed, has a 7-point drop in trust. Our thesis, if you read 3 or 4 news sources a day, if you also check the information with other sources to make sure that it's accurate, you are, in a short, closing the societal divide. You are helping repair society. We find information quality is the most powerful trust builder across institutions. This is not any longer the job of media. It is the job of every institution to support media, to make sure that media is added to. We've had job losses in media. We've had move to polarization. We have to have every institution, from business to government to NGOs, adding to the news flow. We are optimistic for this year. We believe that we can restore trust and thereby get to societal stability. Here are 4 to-dos. Business, the societal role is here to stay. Remember, 5 to 1, people want more of you, not less, on climate or race or upskilling. Second, we have to show that the system works. We have to have tangible progress. We have to be sure that people believe that we can have fair outcomes, that the system can succeed for all. Third, I give business great credit for moving its time horizons to longer-term thinking. Other institutions have to follow suit. We have to have solutions over divisiveness. We have to have long-term thinking over short-term momentary gains. Lastly, it's every institution's job to provide trustworthy information. Clear, concise, easily accessible, fact-based. We've got to break this horrible cycle of distrust. Gillian, with that, I pass it to you. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much indeed, Richard. And as some of you know, I've had the pleasure of moderating this discussion at Davos for several years, which kind of gives me a historical perspective on the Trust Barometer. And I must say, I find this particular year's results the most depressing that we have seen so far. That's partly for purely personal reasons. As a journalist, some people might regard it as divine retribution that the trust in media has tumbled so far after all the years when journalists were criticizing other institutions. But it's a very, very serious societal problem, as Richard points out, in terms of the impact of this widespread mistrust in media and information. But what's also very concerning is the degree to which we're seeing this cycle of distrust, this gap between the general public and leaders, and also the degree to which we're seeing the bedrock of democratic trust in democracies being eroded particularly starkly. Sitting talking to you from New York, that's very, very alarming indeed. But what's also clear is the degree to which business is now in the spotlight, along with non-governmental groups. So we have a terrific panel of people to talk about this today and reflect on not just why things have gone so badly wrong, but most importantly, what they could or should be doing to try and address these challenges. We've got Oliver Bäte, CEO of Allianz, the gigantic insurance group that's been at the forefront in the insurance sector of pushing for measures to address climate change. We've got Becky Frankiewicz, who is president of Manpower Group, which is at the heart of a debate about what employees are doing and what they want and how that's changing. We've got Enrique Lores, who's the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, which of course is an enormous company at the very heart of the American corporate world, and gives us a very good perspective on what could or should be done from the American corporate perspective, and also as a group that has a footprint around the world. We have Dr. Mathur, who's Director General of International Solar Alliance from India, who can talk to us about the emerging market aspect, and in particular, how people perceive the current climate change debate from the perspective of the emerging markets world. And Dr. David Nabarro, who's Special Envoy for COVID-19 at the World Health Organization, who can address the question of not just what COVID-19 has done to our trust in institutions, but also, perhaps most crucially, how the role of misinformation is or is not being addressed as we all face the pandemic. So different perspectives here, very powerful, very valuable. And of course, we have all of you watching. I will say what we're going to do is have a conversation for about 20 minutes and then bring in questions from the audience. So do please start sending in the questions as soon as you feel inspired, because it's easier to pull them into the conversation naturally when I hear from you, and I want to get as many questions from the audience as I possibly can. But perhaps I can start with you, Oliver, and ask you, we've had the gauntlet throw down to business. The survey suggests that businesses are going to have to grapple with societal challenges if they are going to be trusted and respected, and their employees want them to do more, not less. And of course, this morning we had Larry Fink, who came out with a clarion call for businesses to do precisely that, and argued that that wasn't a question of them being woke. And yet we also have this very interesting detail in the survey that Richard highlighted about the fact that Republicans distrust business more than Democrats now, and much of that appears to be a backlash against woke being regarded as something which is left-wing. So I'm curious, when you look at your employees and your board and your managers, do you think you have strong buy-in for more of a societal mission? And what does it actually translate into in practical terms?
So, Gillian, thank you very much. And Richard, really great survey that helps us a lot. Now, my answer, Gillian, is informed by the fact that we were founded 131 years ago in Germany. So we're in the center of Europe. And we have something that's after the Second World War was called the social market economy. So the issue of stakeholder capitalism that's been discovered in the United States over the last few years has been sort of part of the framework, with all the advantages and disadvantages, of course, for many, many years. So for example, when I became CEO, we anchored employee and customer satisfaction into the financial targets of the top management and cascaded that down to 150,000 people. And it's literally a cliff. So if you perform very badly on customer service or employee motivation, you have no access to your bonus pool. I'm not sure that too many institutions have that. So we're a little bit in a particular place. So my answer is informed by that. The real issue, and I think that's Richard mentioned it on the trust component and why people trust their companies, it's very hard for many people to understand what is a fact today versus what is a story that is not bad. So it's very hard for people to understand, as you are targeted by social media in particular with tainted information to lead you to buy something. Even, by the way, when you're on a website, on a media outlet, you get stipulated based on what you read before, you start to distrust any source of information, unless it's your family, it's your friends, and it's your employer where you're spending. I don't think that's it. The second, with COVID, we've seen in a crisis, federal democratic bottom-up systems fail to work. As a former military person, I can tell you many things work great in democracies all the time, but in a crisis, you need different governance systems, you need different execution systems, particularly in the public domain. And we've seen also in Germany, and I think it's explaining one of the big drops, is we failed. In Germany, we literally failed to organize between the central government, between the state government, and we have been under-investing in really administration quality and infrastructure for many, many years in this country, despite the fact that we've had 15 years of amazing economic returns, almost full unemployment. So people are disappointed. And I think I would use that also to interpret the results. The outcome is, from our perspective, is for the vast majority of Europe, the issue is not whether we want stakeholder capitalism, but how do we make that work? How do we balance the realities of today with the need to change them? So today in Europe, for example, 17% of our energy consumption comes out of sustainable energy. And everybody says latest by 2040, we need to be out of that. And it's very hard to do. So the people just do not trust the governments and the institutions to deliver the outcomes that we all feel we need to have. And we need to build that. So for our company, the point is we have to be with the basics. We have to say, are we the market leader in customer satisfaction? Are we the company that people want to work for? Do we deliver outcomes that are sustainably successful? It's a bit basic, but we need to have them delivered. And I think this is what people see. That's what the employees see. There are institutions, not all businesses, but many that deliver on their promises and others don't. Sorry, that's the simple job I'm trying to do every day.
Right. And just very quickly, do you have any backlash against the stakeholder vision of capitalism at the moment? I mean, I can't imagine you have a large Republican base inside the company, but do you have backlash from any of your investors?
No, The investors, however, are trying to understand how you square the circle. In our case, it's pretty clear, and as apparently Mr. Fink said it this morning, you can't run a great company without great people. So if you have an undersupply of highly talented people, you better make them really excited about working for your company. If you don't have the highest customer satisfaction, that's why people go to Google. They don't go to Google because they're so nice. They have just spectacular products. So we need to make sure we have the products that people want to have. And we're coming from an industry where profits and distribution system and everything was regulated. With technology changing, that's no more the case. So I actually think we're overcomplicating matters. It is that both capital, talent, and customers are in undersupply, and there's an oversupply of companies. And we will have a lot of companies disappear that do not address these stakeholders successfully at the same time.
Interesting. Well, it seems like a great moment to bring in Becky to talk about the employees and the extraordinary situation none of us dreamt would be in, where actually you have companies fighting for employees, not employees necessarily fighting for jobs in many sectors. I'm curious, Becky, how has the Great Resignation changed this debate? Is it real? And to what degree do you really believe these data points about employees asking companies to actually have a societal purpose when they decide who to work for?
Yeah, thank you, Gillian. First, I would say that the pandemic has changed us, and it is the global us, it is us as worker, it is us as company leader. The pandemic has changed us. And so rather than focusing on new beginnings as we start this new year, we're counseling our clients to focus on some endings that we can celebrate. And all these endings are feeding into what you called the Great Resignation, but what we would say is this great realization that employers and people are realizing that work is different in the future. We're not going back to the past. We're going forward to something new. And I'll highlight a couple of those endings. I will preview for the audience. 3 are truly global in nature, and 1 is more US, UK focused. And so the first is this end of work over health. I mean, I can think of myself when I was growing up. If you came into the office and you didn't feel well, you were celebrated. It was like, oh, good for you. You're committed, you're driven, you will be successful here. That was crazy. And the pandemic ended that, and that's a positive. Now, if you don't feel well, employers and employees are encouraged to have the ownership to stay home. The end of family sacrifice. People are now empowered to say, I want to do the pickup line for school, or I need to drop off in the morning. I can do that and have a fulfilling career. And so that's another celebrated ending. This one hits a little close to home for many business leaders, the end of pledges without progress. And so employees and consumers are tired now of pledges. We want action. We want realization of goals, and we want the report of progress. And it's something I think as business leaders, it's not enough just to sign a pledge. Now workers want to see, what are you actually doing? What are the steps I can feel towards that pledge? And we see a lot of that showing up in the trust barometer, where people are looking to business for progress because of the competence that business embodies. And the last one I'll say, and again, a little bit more US and UK focused, but make no mistake, structural change is the end of minimum and maximum wage. And so this concept of a minimum wage or even a real wage is gone. It's a required wage. What's required to attract people into the workforce. And we are absolutely, to your question on societal issues, we are absolutely seeing employees around the world, and you heard it's actually catching up in the US. This is not necessarily new in Europe, but around the world, employers are voting with their skills towards their values on where they'll work. And I believe Richard's study, he mentioned that highlighted 60% of employees are saying, I want to work at a place that takes a stance on societal issues. And we are seeing that from the knowledge worker all the way to the blue collar worker, that is a fact.
Well, that's fascinating. I must say we're getting some terrific questions right now questions about NGOs, questions about how you change, the sense of helplessness amongst people, about change, about executive compensation, about trust, So I'm going to come back to those later on. But before I do, Enrique, I'm curious, from your point of view, how do you see the employee-employer contract changing at the moment? And how comfortable are you about doing what the survey suggests, which is having a personal leadership role in addressing potentially hot button societal issues, not just climate change, but bigger issues around the S in the ESG complex?
Gillian and Richard, thank you for organizing this. I think you touch on a few very critical points. First of all, I think all of us as CEOs now have a role to stand for the values of our companies. I think our employees are expecting that, our customers are expecting that, and our investors are expecting that. So I feel very confident doing that, both because it's our way to show what we really want to achieve, and also because we are getting demand from our key stakeholders to do that. And in the context of that, as you are saying, the relationship with our employees is also evolving. They are looking not only for a job that will bring some money to them at the end of the month, they are really looking to participate in something that will be bigger than that. They want to participate and work for a company that they believe will have a positive impact in the world, will have a positive impact in the society. And I think as a CEO, my role is to make sure that I make that possible, that we define our goals, not only driven by what are our financial objectives, but really driven by what is the role and the impact that we want to have in the world. And by declaring them and inviting the teams to participate, I think we are changing the relationship and evolving the relationship in the way our employees are expecting it to change.
Right. Are there particular issues which you feel that you have begun to speak out on publicly, which you weren't, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago as a result of this changing employee expectation?
I think clearly during the last few years, there has been a lot of changes in the world that had requested our direct involvement. And I would highlight two. First of all, is climate change. I think climate change is one of the major threats the world has had in the history of humankind. And I think all of us have to play a role, and we have really been very aggressive defining the goals for the company, and again, engaging employees to drive that. And the second, that was made very visible during the last 2 years again, is digital diversity and inclusion. We need to make sure that as a company, we embrace the values that we need to have to offer the opportunity for anybody to grow and to develop. And also we need to use the company as a platform to influence our partners, our suppliers, and the rest of the industry. And in these two areas, we are driving a very big change, and again, engaging with our employees to make it happen.
Right, thank you. Before I turn to our sort of NGO representatives, I'd just like to quickly ask you three, as representing private sector business, one question, which is that, one of the other themes that come out of the survey is the fact that trust is local. And you're increasingly looking at community-based trust, and yet Oliver and Enrique are representing enormous global companies. And I'm just curious if any of you want to comment on how you deal with this issue about trust being local, and yet you're part of enormous companies. Is it sort of more local in a metaphorical sense that, I know who my employer is, or what does that actually mean in practice? Or even Becky, maybe you want to comment on this.
Yeah, let me start. I think, yes, we are all global companies, but we all have local presence. And what we do is define what the global directions are, but then make sure that at the local level, each group, each factory, each organization can translate that into whatever is important in that community. And this balance of global and local really helps us to make a difference, because I think you're right. People want to connect with something that is closer to them. And sometimes managing the company from the headquarters, we are too far from our people.
Oliver or Becky? Becky, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think that's exactly right. So these big mega global companies have local presence. Yet also, Enrique, I would add that you can be local wherever your focus is. And so I think there is this goal of CEOs to have intimacy philosophically local, to your comment, Gillian, versus physically local, because it is true that employees are voting for who they work for, and the ultimate person they work for is the CEO. And so I think it is important to not feel like as a global CEO, you're too far removed. You need the local presence as well, but you have a tremendous, you pull on the heartstrings of your employees, even if you lead a large global organization. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And communications from CEOs do feel local, because you're my CEO, you're not someone else's CEO.
I mean, Oliver, I'm just curious because German corporate culture isn't known for being cuddly and bearing their soul in front of their employees and having a kiss and tell kind of approach to employee management. Just curious, I mean, how are you managing that? And then we will turn to the NGO perspective.
I think that's very good. Thank you. You phrased it nicely. So I want to go to the general question, both on customer closeness and employee closeness. It's actually very similar. It is the local company and the relevance of the globality to that. So in Italy, let's say, if we're not adding value because we are bringing Allianz capability Italy and make it a distinctive service for our local customers in Italy, in the language, in the community it works, it's irrelevant. If it's for the Italian employee in Trieste, it's not distinctive, it's irrelevant. So the translation into the local community, sort of KPIs, Gillian, if I may allow to use the Anglo-Saxon context, that's what really matters. So if you can translate that, just the fact that you are global, big, rich, successful is completely meaningless. It has to be meaningful relative to the local benchmark. And that is what we often forgot in the past.
Right, that's fascinating. Well, I'd like to turn to Dr. Mathur now, because, of course, one of the points that Enrique pointed to was the importance of climate change for the corporate move to try and have more of a societal role. You're obviously involved in this very deeply from the Indian perspective, but you're also very involved in trying to forge public-private partnerships in that respect. And, one of the other messages from the Edelman survey was that, in many ways, partnering with NGOs is one way that governments can try and build the trust and the credibility and efficacy perspective. So I'm curious from your point of view, is there a potential for business and NGOs to be working together more effectively in this area, and could both benefit in terms of raising public trust?
Well, Julian, the quick answer is yes. But before that, many thanks to you and much more to Richard for this fascinating worldview. This is something that I think the world got onto a few years before we did. I look at Leonardo DiCaprio's movie, Don't Look Up, which is exactly about this. People don't want to listen to the media and to the government. Oops. Those are the people we in the climate change world tried to convince and put forward for the last 20 years. Where does this leave us? Gillian, your question hits the nail on the head. As an international organization, the International Solar Alliance seeks partnerships with the private sector, seeks partnerships with NGOs. Why? At the very end, the solar projects are things on the ground. They mean something to you who are living nearby. They either provide you with electricity which is cheaper, or electricity which is greener, or lower pollution, or whatever. But the impacts are felt not only globally, but also locally. Local NGOs, as was said, know the context. Local businesses know how the system works in the communities that they are working. Whether it is local employment, whether it is the local connectivity, that's where the linkages lie. And Gillian, if I may, I think this leads us to an important issue. The kinds of collaborations that we're looking at in the future are very different. We are not looking at huge collaborations between governments. We are looking at collaborations between international organizations which help create the kinds of models, the technological models with NGOs, with the private sector, make them happen. Once you make them happen, business models follow. The role of governments is to change the policy so that business models can be replicated. You don't want one demo which an NGO does. You want the private sector to do millions of them. That's where a new collaborative model becomes effective. Short point, as we move ahead, very clearly, we need to snap people out of their comfort zones, where they're happy, they can be selfish. You want to move them into a world where they are willing to look at the new. Why? Because in my community, this was done. It's my local people who did it. That's what moves us ahead.
Well, that's fascinating. And in many ways, quite inspiring if one can translate that into action. But David, I mean, but we have got a lot of questions about NGOs. Actually, I'll come back to the questions about trust in the NGOs in a moment. But before I do, perhaps I could just ask you, Dr. Mathur, this, which is, what do you think are the main determinants of trust in NGOs? Is it the ability to execute locally and have that demonstration effect, or are there other issues you think that NGOs need to do right now?
Gillian, I think there are three kinds of trusts that matter. One, of course, is the effectiveness in delivering what you said. The key there is expectations, the expectations that the community has and the expectations that the NGO provides. That's number one. Second is the information that you're bringing in, because local communities often look to NGOs as the source of information. In my world, technical information, but whatever is the kind of information. So that's the second trust. The third trust is in their ability to get the local communities involved. What they show is here are business models through which local people can get jobs. It's these three kinds of trusts, the three pillars of trust, which carry NGOs ahead.
Well, that's fascinating, because again, that throws down the gauntlet to business, and many people watching are from the private sector, and that's very thought-provoking indeed. But I'd like to bring you in, Dr. David Nabarro, because you have been in the hot seat for much of the last 2 years, in a very well sense. I'm sure the question everyone wants to ask you straight up front is, when is it going to be? When is it going to end? Maybe you can say that quickly at the beginning, because everyone wants to know that desperately. But I'm also curious for your perspective on what on earth does the healthcare community do about misinformation? Is it something you're just going to have to live with? Or can trust in information from scientists, doctors, actually become more widespread, and trust in the right information become more widespread?
Thank you very much, Gillian. It will end when it ends, and it will not disappear. The virus will simply become something that we can live with without it disturbing our social and economic lives in an excessive way. And that will take quite a long time, depending on where we are in the world. In poorer countries right now, it's going to take a lot longer than in wealthier countries. In the work that I do with the World Health Organization, I'm often asked by people, who can I trust to help me through all this? And we enter into debates and discussions, and usually I'm told it is genuine, authentic experts who connect with people and deliver. I think the authenticity is really important. And after reading the Trust Barometer, I thought, what can we do in the health communities around the world, perhaps to be more authentic and more trusted? Because there is a lot of misinformation around, which is really hampering the response to the pandemic. I've got 5 things that I'd like to share quickly. First of all, let's be honest. All of humanity is affected by this pandemic. So a trusted response is one that looks at the whole world, not at a subset of the world. We need to connect with people wherever they are. Secondly, it's important to adopt holistic approaches. People are the solution because the virus is the problem, but we need to be able to engage people in all their capabilities. And we're seeing huge opportunities from treating people as the solution. Thirdly, it's important to display humility in the face of this pandemic. After all, it's a new virus. We've not had a coronavirus before, a pandemic before, in my memory. And the reality is that there's an awful lot that is not known. The reason why I can't tell you when the pandemic is going to end is because I don't know. And if I gave you an estimate, it would be a really incorrect thing to do. It is important that that humility is genuine. Fourth, got to be actually honest. And I mean, there's no substitute for it. If a leader in response to the pandemic promises that there will be all restrictions removed by date X, it's perfectly reasonable to people to say, I don't think that can be honest, because this leader doesn't have necessarily the knowledge to be sure that things can be improved by a particular date. It's obviously not honest. And empty promises or false pledges, quite honestly, just don't get us anywhere. And lastly, I think we have to be hopeful. After all, humanity has the most remarkable instrument up here, the brain, and humans working together can deal with just about any challenge that exists. We need to be able to demonstrate hope where hope is justified. So those are just some thoughts. And actually, I have to say, we are extremely exercised about the current misinformation situation and very pleased to receive any advice that anybody can give us as to how we can help everybody work together to get on top of this pandemic.
Well, thank you for your message, which is both hopeful, humble, clear and honest. And I think you lay out a number of communication points which probably apply to anybody, not just people working in the medical sphere right now. As I said earlier, we've had some terrific questions, and there's one question I'd love to ask you straight away, Dr. Nabarro, which is this, and we do really have some terrific questions from the audience, so thank you. Trust in government is tumbling at exactly the time when COVID has brought us arguably more government than ever via public health campaigns. So does this tell us that distrust in government is increasing because of the COVID response or in spite of it?
And I actually think that the reason why governments are in such difficulty at the moment is that just about every single decision that has to be made is really difficult. There's always trade-offs, and the trade-offs are sometimes quite hard to capture and to communicate clearly. It is my view that it's the challenge that leaders face in truly explaining why they make decisions and what trade-offs they're actually employing, that is a direct contributor to mistrust. And it may well be that unless political leaders find a way to express the trade-offs they're making and to explain them to the public in clear language, there is going to be continued mistrust. So I would actually really answer that question by suggesting that it is proving to be extremely hard for modern political leaders to explain carefully to their constituents the kind of trade-offs that they're making and why they're doing it, simply because they feel they'll lose too many votes when they adopt that kind of balanced approach.
That's very interesting. I must say, I strongly agree. The issue of trade-offs is very hard in an era of pick and mix politics, where coalesces around single brands.
How do you explain a trade-off in a tweet? Jolly hard, in my experience.
Exactly. When everyone's making their own pick and mix choice about what they want to focus on, rather than taking a package. But I'm curious, because that leads into another question, which is great, which I'd love to ask both Enrique and Oliver, which is this: as business leaders, how do we or you get high and positive engagement with society, not just with your own employees and customers, so that you can address some of the trends that Rich is highlighting? And there's a question that's twinned with that, which is slightly less comfortable, I would imagine, but we've had a couple of questions about whether issues around high executive pay and whether issues about bad business practices risk undermining what companies are trying to do in a more positive way. Maybe I can start with you, Oliver, about any thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, let me start with the first question. I think it's really, really important to reflect that it's different by societies. So if you go deeper into the Edelman report, it's very different by societies, what people expect you to talk about. In our case, when you are having every third German as your client, for example, in other countries more every 10th, then the expectations are different, for example, also by the relevance of the brand. Why do I say that? Because we basically refrain from telling politicians on what to do. We'd like to have the dialogue, but we are not elected officials. But there are exceptions. So when it gets to health insurance, when it gets to mobility, when it gets to how do you invest, we are expected to have the competence, we are expected to have an opinion. When it gets to how you run other items, it's more difficult. So when we started to talk about climate change 6-7 years ago, together with COP24, a lot of business people, particularly the energy sector, what the heck are you getting involved in our business? So then you have to very carefully establish of why the heck are you stepping into an area that is not seen to be your core area of competence. As the largest institutional investor in this country, in one of the top 10 in Europe, then you have to say, well, if the money doesn't really drive investment into clean energy, it's never going to happen. So that's why we have to do that. So you need to educate the public, and then you can have a statement. And the last one, my only response is Allianz was voted to have the best executive incentive system in this country for many years. So I think that's okay.
Right. Okay. Over to you, Enrique.
I think the way to really gain credibility is by integrating the objectives around, for example, climate change or diversity and inclusion or digital equity integrated in the business plans. We don't manage them in a separate way. For us, they are not a different set of objectives. Our objectives we need to achieve as we continue to grow our business, as we continue to develop our business. And I think this is a good way to show both our commitment and also to really gain credibility because we report and we manage them together. And I think in terms of executive compensation, I think that the practice that every company should follow, which is what we follow, is really reward based on the value that is created. And this value really needs to be measured not only in terms of profitability, but also in terms of the progress that we make in a broader perspective. And this is what we do in the company.
Right, right. I'd like to bring you in, Dr. Mathur, to address a really interesting question here, which I wasn't expecting, which is this. In contrast to fairness, how do you address the issue of helplessness, the state of cognitive concern where people don't believe that they can change anything and are powerless to bridge this gap? And of course, it's an issue which is particularly interesting right now in terms of the debate around climate change. So I'm curious for any thoughts you have about that.
Gillian, I again go back to the power of projects that are done locally, because if somebody has this feeling of helplessness, the only way to get them out of it is when they actually participate in a project which makes something, which does something, say a solar panel which provides electricity to local households, a mini grid. It gives them hope that they can contribute, that their contribution makes a difference to the lives of others. I know this is not a full answer, but my belief is that at the end of the day, helplessness is addressed by making the people feel that they are themselves useful and they're useful to others.
So a demonstration effect of projects that are close enough to be understood and, part of the local business.
And the impact it has on yourself, that I am also doing something which helps others.
Well, as part of the great untrusted media, I can tell you that stories about, any kind of projects actually make for much better copy and ways of illustrating themes than abstract concepts. But Becky, question for you. What role do you think that NGOs, media and government have, if any, in moving us past the great resignation moment? You may not accept the label great resignation, but do you think that the way to address this is really about dealing with just private sector businesses and employees, or do NGOs and governments and the media have a role to play as well?
Yeah, it appears that we're going to need a level of collaboration and cooperation and innovation between all stakeholders, private and public, that we have not seen in our past. And what I mean by that is, we spend a lot of time also with universities, not just employers. We need universities teaching the soft skills that are now in demand in the economy, not just the hard skills, around degree programs. We need NGOs and the partnerships, and I love the concept of hope. We need those partnerships with business to help us innovate in new ways with heart and empathy and capability as we go forward. And so, and for media, for employers to communication to be the most trusted, we need partnership with media. So if we're going to be the voice of that, how do we have the resources and the research and the unbiased view that media was formerly known for? How do we incorporate that into how we go forward as corporations? And so, Gillian, I think it's essential to move forward. We ultimately want the world to be prosperous. We want economic growth and we want individual household growth. And to do that, all of these entities are going to need to come together, because my fear for business is we're being put on a pedestal now that we don't have all the capabilities to fulfill. And so it will take all of us working and learning and acting together in new ways to, I think, have the next S curve of economic growth and individual prosperity for the world.
Yeah, well, the problem with being on a pedestal, there's only one way to go after that.
Only one to go.
But I'm curious, we're almost out of time, but I've got one other quick question, which is actually the last question. We managed to get through the questions. I wanted to ask any of you who want to chip in, maybe you can wave at me or just speak out, which is that this, and it's a quite self-interested question. What does the drop in trust in social media mean for communicators? Should we continue to invest in channels that are generally not trusted, i.e., should you stop spending money on social media messaging and spend it all on the traditional media or on your owned media instead? I'm sure Richard will have views on this, but I'm curious whether any of you have thought about what these really quite shocking results from the media part of the survey suggest for your strategy going forward. Enrique or Oliver, have you thought about this at all, or Dr. Mathur, in terms of getting the climate message out?
Well, I think you have to, because this is where people are expecting to get their information. I think what we need to do is realize how important empathy and connecting with people is. And it's not only about broadcasting information that could be or not be true, but I think using the new technology tools to connect with people in general, or with employees or with consumers is really critical, and try to do that in a trustworthy and connected way.
Dr. Mathur or Dr. Nabarro from the NGO side, do you have views on this?
Well,
And just very quickly from me, social media help us to connect with unusual realities, and we can actually be quite selective. So I think for most of us, social media are not used to obtain trusted information, but they're used to obtain contextual information, which makes us more rounded people.
Fascinating. Dr. Mathur, sorry, I cut you off there.
Well, Gillian, I come back to the point that you had mentioned. A project story is worth much more than an ideological story. I'm putting words in your mouth. What this tells us is that things that are built around stories make much more sense. And consequently, anchoring the information on real life experiences always helps. I'll give you an example. At the International Solar Alliance, we build, for example, technical things like guidance, like standards based on case studies, which are essentially stories.
Right. Well, as someone who's in the story business, I love stories. So I approve of anyone who upholds those. But we're almost out of time. But Oliver or Becky, any last thoughts quickly?
Yeah, I'll just say I'd take a little contrarian view on social media. I think, Dr. Nabarro, your commentary around authenticity, being honest, social media does provide the platform for that. I think the challenge is, how do we get the right, accurate, truthful information into those channels? Because the younger generations, I mean, I have 3 daughters, they get their education in large part from TikTok. And so we can't ignore that. I think we have to embrace the channel and figure out how we put truthful, authentic messages into the channel.
Oliver, are you about to go on TikTok?
I don't know, but I think they are using all channels. I would like to differentiate very quickly between the data, but the question is, how do you get to decisions? I think it's very important to also go back. How do you make decisions under high uncertainty? We talked about decision making for politicians when you have to deal with something that hasn't been there for 100 years. And how do you help interpret and tell people that you cannot make a perfect decision, but people accept that. But 2 years down the road, you need to do better. So I want to go back to whatever the channel is and whatever the facts are, we need to get to better outcomes for the stakeholders, and they will tell you whether they get a better outcome. So democracy is not failing because it's a bad concept. It just doesn't deliver the outcomes that people expect. So we also need to stop promising things that we know we can't deliver. That's really the worry I have.
Well, that's a very good note on which to end. I mean, as I said before, it's been a sobering study, a particularly sobering study for a journalist sitting in America. But I think it raises challenges for all of us wherever we're based. So I'm just going to hand back to Richard for last thoughts and say once again, thank you for a very interesting discussion. And I just hope that when we reconvene this time next year, it won't have got even worse. So over to you, Richard.
So, Gillian, thank you for a marvelous panel. I think that the central challenge for all of us is to demonstrate real progress on society's 4 key issues, which are sustainability, equity and inclusion, retraining, and fairness, wage fairness in particular. And for me, I read the biography of Keynes over the holiday, and his Economic Consequences of the Peace was a very important book because World War I basically destroyed a lot of trade relationships. It upset the society in such a way as to, destabilize the middle class. The inflation that was ensuing ruined people's savings, led to, obviously bad consequences to World War II. But we've had 2 big shocks in the last 20 years. We had the Great Recession, and now we've had the pandemic. And it's unfortunately shown some of the shortcomings of society, the mass class divide, the weakness of democracy relative to single party or autocracy, the fairness of dealing with those who are less well off in terms of health outcomes. We have to be very tangible, step by step, and say, we are going to retrain people. We are going to deal with the diverse populations and make sure that they have the ability to compete fairly. We're going to make sure that the developing countries have ability to, grow their economies while dealing with the climate change issue. It is down to business to lead in the next year, ladies and gentlemen. It is very clear from our data that it is the one institution that has the freedom and the authority to do so. But do it advisedly. Don't say that I can do everything, because you're not appointed and you're not elected. Do it with government, do it with NGOs. And please, let's all improve the quality of information. The future of society depends on quality data so that people can make good decisions. We are all part of this. Thanks everybody so much for joining today, and particularly to the panelists and to Gillian, who's heroic. Thank you.